So your primary repression is something that you wouldn't know anything about. Let's be clear about that. And that's why we have to take some time to discover what that is, because that's what you primarily avoid, the traits and the emotions that are scariest for you. That's what you've buried. So we have to be careful when we first start KI of thinking that we can just easily name what that is when we've spent a whole lifetime avoiding those things. Some of us have an easier time of naming our primary. Remember, the primary repression is not just one thing. It's a set of emotions and traits. And so, when you start to go deep into KI, when you're really skillful with it, you stay at the home station of fear, the frozen fear, the fear of being yourself, the fear that underlies all suffering, basically. But also the fear that underlies the repression and trauma, the fear of feeling and expressing anger, for example, the fear of feeling and expressing that I'm hurt, that I'm sad, that I'm whatever. So when you're doing skillful KI, after a while, your fear is your home station, and you build your little cul-de-sac, or your part of the neighborhood where you venture, for example, as an anger repressor. That was part of my repression. I would go to anger quite often in inquiry, but of course it was a fear of anger. See, holding anger back that made me sick. So it's the fear home station and then going to anger. And then, of course, as you guys know, femininity is part of my primary. So that was like on my other side of the home station. So I go there to make sure that repression, or the anger repression, that's what was driving all the suffering. And then there was some joy repression. So joy was like the house next door to femininity. That's my cul-de-sac. In KI, I don't leave my cul-de-sac. If you leave your cul-de-sac, you're bypassing in KI, generally. This is why I say, like, if I'm an anger repressor, the way that I repressed anger is I didn't really repress the vulnerable emotions like sadness and hurt that much. So that's like a house down the road. You can't see me, but my arm is reaching. You're not going to visit that house much. You've already probably been visiting that house too much. You've been camped out there. We don't want to keep going back there. Not in KI. You don't want to go to the places that are really, really comfortable emotionally in KI. It's just, that's the bypass. Even though you want to go there because you want to stay safe and get love, you don't want to stay in your cul-de-sac because you've avoided the emotions and traits in your cul-de-sac to stay safe and get love from people, to survive. That's the root of suffering. So if you keep going down the road to the safe stuff and avoid the primary, more suffering. Remember, suffering in KI is defined as coming from the experience of holding back what's true, your primary repression. Then you're forced to identify with what's false. So yeah, you might want to go to sadness because you might be more identified with it, but that's not the root of it. You might be more identified with the deficiency story, but that's not the root of the suffering. It's your primary repression, right here in your own cul-de-sac that you stay in. Now, the question is when you first get to KI, how do you know what makes up your cul-de-sac? You're part of the neighborhood. Well, you know that fear is right here. This is where you live, in fear. So you do your inquiry at that home base. The question is, how are you going to build your primary from there? You don't want to assume it's anger just because Scott Killaby's was anger. It might be anger, though. How do you determine that? It's not easy for everybody. That's why I'm doing this video. There's only so much I can do without meeting with people. Or if you're having difficulty, or if you think you've misnamed your primary, don't do KI. Why are you doing KI? I have to say that. Because the whole purpose of KI is to name your primary and do inquiry there. So if you have not named it, or if you have a concern of whether you've named it incorrectly, I wouldn't do KI. Because I've seen bad things happen anytime people bypass. But when you start bypassing in a modality like this, where you're stirring stuff up, you're opening cans of worms at the unconscious level, but you're not going skillfully to the root of the repression. Instead, you're going to somewhere safer. Addictions can get stronger. Conflict with people shut down more. Chronic pain can get worse. So if you see that stuff happening, check into whether you've really named your primary correctly, or have you included everything in the primary that needs to be included. There was still some level of suffering because I didn't include the femininity in. See, that's why I had to bring that in. And by the way, people say, do you still put makeup on every day? You just can't always see it. And as I've said, I like to pretty Chester up a lot. He's a really pretty girl. I'll show you sometime how pretty he is. He's just a pretty boy. But yeah, I love the girly side of me still very much. Very happy with the results of KI. There's your cul-de-sac, but it's not that easy for everybody. I'm trying to help. Like, I just tell you, here's the places to go to find the answer. Learn your Enneagram type. Because if you're like one of the anger points, 8, 9, 1, then you've probably got some repressed anger. That's helpful to just know if you're one of those types. Or if you have a wing in that area where you're repressing some, or your relationship to anger is a certain way. The 8 type is not necessarily repression like the 9 type, but I've seen definitely repression of anger in that area of the Enneagram. Now, that's not the only area where there's a repression. So you can have like a 4 type and have repressed anger. You could be a 3 type and repress anger. But the 9 type and the 1 type especially have a particularly avoidant relationship with anger. The ones on the Enneagram, they might come up as like more perfectionist, like judgy, maybe. But it's anger. It just might not be processed. It might be coming up as judgment. And the 9s on the Enneagram are more peacemakers. Like, we're just quiet. We don't judge. We do that internally and unconsciously. Until we don't anymore. So that helps the Enneagram. Just take the test or read the types and see if you can feel into it that way. Your fighting style helps. So I say to people, if your fighting style is fight, like when you and your spouse get into a dispute, if you like to go to fighting, you probably don't repress anger. Because you usually have to get angry to fight like that, if that's your first instinct. If you're a fleer, though, it could indicate perhaps repression of something like anger. There's no right or wrong. There's no better fighting style, but it sometimes helps us to understand how our body responds in a dispute. Where do we go? Do we go towards somebody, in which case anger might be online, or do we turn away from somebody or freeze, in which case anger and other things are not online? But that doesn't tell us everything, because how we fight or whether we fight at all it helps us. So, I mean, an anger repressor might flee and then shut down around that emotion. But it could be somebody who flees who's not an anger repressor, and they just get really angry and they call the person up and tell them how angry they are. They just didn't want to do it in person or something. I don't know. You have to find your own way in this. You have to find your life. You have to look at your life and see, how do you relate to people when you do fight? What do you show in terms of emotions and what do you not? Are there any emotions that you show? Are you more likely to show vulnerable emotions? That can mean that you're an anger repressor. If you're more likely to show vulnerable emotions, if you're more likely to show anger, it could be an indication of repression of vulnerable emotions like sadness or hurt. It's not a golden rule, but it could indicate that. They're all just factors, and you have to really trust your own body and your own experience in the end. If you're somebody who can't speak up, it's hard to set a boundary, you have difficulty saying no, those are indicators of anger repression, but that's not a rule. If you have a history of disconnecting from people, this is also, all repression does this though. So sadness repressors might say they have disconnection in their past, but we anger repressors, we disconnect a certain ways. Like, we won't get angry before we disconnect. We just leave or ignore people or stop the relationship and we don't talk to them again. And that having a history of those kinds of disconnections where you just, there's no explanation, there's no nothing, it's just over and done. Yeah, look for that anger repression. Again, it might also be with the other repressions. Some people say shame is their primary, but here's the thing with shame is that it's made of other emotions. So if you were shamed as a child, you might have stored anger around that event, that you just stored it. Or you might feel deeply hurt or humiliated around something, and that was stored in that shame programming. And so now the shame is really a combination of that anger, or the hurt or humiliation, and the fear of being seen. But see, we can even hide in that, naming that, because if I say, well, shame is my primary, it could be. That could be somehow your primary, but are you going to use that to hide from the anger, fear, and hurt and humiliation inside that? You just have to be careful how you name things, because there's some very basic emotions that we have to deal with here. And we have to be careful how we're bamboozling ourselves out of that. And I'm talking about anger, fear, hurt, sadness. And then in addition to that, certain traits and other things like joy or emotions, joy, love, femininity, masculinity, sexuality, sexual orientation, surprise, whatever can arise can be repressed. But my point is, don't get too busy naming a bunch of traits that are repressed if that just keeps you safe from the anger, hurt, and fear. See? Or naming something apart from that so that you don't have to deal with the anger or the hurt and the fear, the sadness. So it's like people come in and say, well, my repression is fear. Well, I'll say that's everybody's repression. Everybody has fear. Fear of anger, fear of hurt. Fear, I don't see how you get out of that one. That's a universal primary. So there's your home station. But then I'll say, what else is repressed? And they have trouble answering it. And I think in that situation, they're just using fear to avoid the anger or the hurt. There's going to be something else there. I mean, unless you'd have this wonderful relationship with all those emotions, like you can just get, like you have fear, but you don't have fear of anger. You have fear, but you don't have fear of sadness or hurt or expression of those things. That's a hard thing to sell, right? To yourself or anyone else, that there's not any other emotional repression there. So just be careful how you name that. Because we love to skirt away from anger and hurt, and we really like to skirt away from anger, we anger repressors. And the hurt repressors really like to squirm away from hurt and sadness. So watch how you might do that in different ways. By saying, like, for example, if you get angry a lot, you're saying that's your problem, anger. No, that's your solution. Your problem is the buried sadness, maybe. So you have to look at it, though, because if you're, again, people are not understanding that for the first few weeks of KI, you don't have much of that repressed emotion showing up. So if you're an anger repressor and you do like 3 or 4 weeks of KI on I'm angry, but I can't get angry, you shouldn't expect much anger during that time. It's repressed. Expect contraction and programming that you discover with the contraction. If you're a sadness repressor, you shouldn't expect sadness or hurt to just be felt in the first few weeks, because it's concretized. It's frozen with the fear in your body. You're not going to feel that. So if you're feeling those emotions early, those are your non-primaries. Those are telling you what's not repressed. That's why through the years as a teacher and a practitioner, sadness, hurt, and woundedness was more not repressed on the surface. So obviously it was the anger that was repressed. If I would have come to KI and said, because I feel sadness, hurt, and woundedness, that's the repression, then I'm totally misnaming it. Because under that is the buried. Some people have the experience that they're all like equally repressed, which is a valid experience, especially if you lived in a household where it actually felt that way. Like you didn't feel like you could cry and you didn't feel like you could get angry, and therefore you were afraid a lot, right? So you have anger, hurt, and fear. And it's hard when you first get to KI to determine, is there one that's more buried than the other? And I don't think you have to, in the beginning, make that decision. I think you should trust your experience and just leave it open and let fear be your home station and work with anger and sadness as part of your cul-de-sac until you determine that maybe one of them has more commands to shut it down. When you go in deeper into KI, you might notice that even though it seemed like anger and sadness were equally repressed, when you work with dad a little bit more, you find that there's this command of don't show it sadness, don't. Whereas you don't have the same kind of command with anger. You might have something, but maybe not like that shuts anger down. And then you just learn from that. And let's say anger is less repressed, so you move it in your cul-de-sac a little further away from you. Metaphorically speaking, just means don't keep going to something that's not the root of suffering, that's more like an effect of the suffering. In other words, the root is holding ourselves back, holding back what's true, forcing us to identify with what's false. What's false just means what gets produced, right? So if anger is produced because I don't repress it, I might identify with it because it's safer than the sadness. See, that's the issue. But we don't want to get stuck just working with identifications because it misses the repression. There's a reason you're identified with anger. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens by itself. There's no separation. Everything is connected. So be careful with those kinds of assumptions. The primary, what a topic. It's like what the Achilles heel of the Scott Killaby teacher thing, because it's like I have to keep coming back to this. And it's a beautiful conversation, but it's frustrating because there's no test. There's no single test that tells you, here's your... I wish we could develop something like that, and maybe we will, but we don't have that. So I keep coming back to the conversation. It's an art more than a science, I've learned. The art of discovering what is buried. There's no single thought that will tell you what it is, and your thoughts are there to keep you from even discovering it. So you can't just sit and think about it, because your mind will always take you to safer places. So if you're sitting there thinking about it, be careful. I would just look from awareness and see where most of the resistance is. I wouldn't be thinking about that too much. Go into inquiry. Yeah. So the result of repression work is that you can feel and express all emotions, and there isn't any block around it. So you're going to want to look where the block is around feeling and expressing emotion. Not just feeling anger, but expressing it. Look for the block around expressing something, because that could indicate where there's a primary. You might be able to feel sadness, but can you express it? Just look for these things, because there's layers to it. Be careful with the whole thing that this is complicated too, because you have to understand that I'm meeting the complicated nature of the nervous system here. I really do think that this is simple, that you guys are angry and you're hurt. Some of you are more angry and some of you are more hurt, but you buried it and you're identifying with stuff that has nothing to do with that. So I'm just pointing you back to the buried stuff and to the simplicity of that, which is that you're angry and you're hurt and you can't acknowledge it. So you want to acknowledge that in awareness and transmute that energy. And that's the answer. Because once you transmute that energy and reverse that repression, you're no longer holding back what's true. You're going to come into the recognition of awareness, because it's the false identification that has you not knowing awareness anyway. So as you reverse the repression, you have to do that within awareness. An ego can't reverse repression. The ego falls away as you reverse repression, because the ego is the false identification. But if you keep avoiding the repression, it won't work in KI. You have to go back to the repression. You have to name it properly. If you don't know the parts of yourself that are offline, you can't bring those parts online. Look for things like creativity and power. Like, I don't have to hold my power back, or I have to hold my creativity back, because even though those can be repressions, they're tied to, again, not being able to be ourselves. So there's emotional repression with it. So if I have to hold back my creativity, see, if I just go right into that for myself, that is tied directly for me to being bullied in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And then therefore to the anger repression and to the other repressions associated with that. So it's not anything new. It just takes me right back to anger repression. See that? And by the way, anger repression, we have to repress self and creativity and life force. So if you feel like creativity is offline, look to anger and other repression. Or power, but you remember, like, creativity, power, femininity, masculinity, those are like traits. And though that they refer to energy, they're connected to emotional repression. So if I went back and said, I can be creative, it's like, no, they bullied me for that. No, I can't. No. repression, but there's fear. I'm afraid. And anger. For me, because I'm an anger repressor. I mean, there isn't right now, but I mean, that's what I would have found, what I did find when I went back. Is there any anger right now? I can be creative. Yeah, there's not anything there with them. I've already did all that work. Actually, I think I just check into it from time to time. In terms of the bullying. Okay, did we cover everything on primary? I don't know. Did we? Did we miss anything? Tell me. Put it in the comments. Just tell me you missed this, and this. Because I'm just talking about naming the primary, and I don't do this very often. I do this video like once every 4 months to help the new people coming. Take the Are You Repressing Emotion test first on YouTube. Mine, Are You Repressing Emotion? Then start the discovery of what is my primary. Build your cul-de-sac. Do the somatic testing then, because then you arm yourself with all the insight you need to do the inside-out path. So are you repressing emotion first? Then naming your primary, including doing sessions or involved with people that can help with that, or come to the members area, and then learn the inside-out path and the inquiry. But you have to learn the somatic testing piece, which is, see, it doesn't matter. Here, say it this way. It doesn't matter what your primary repression is if you don't bring inquiry to how it manifests in your life. It just doesn't matter. Who cares? In a way, I'm an anger repressor. It won't make a difference if I've named that. If when in the moment I can't express myself, I don't go into anger repression inquiry. It just doesn't matter. All I have is knowledge. So we have to bring inquiry to these forms of suffering that the repression is creating. And that's the actual path part. But you can see how important naming the repression is. That's it. Thanks, guys.